Thank you, everyone, for coming back from lunch. It's a little bit hard to see up here. It looks like we got a pretty good turnout so far. Let's see. Disclaimer first. This is my first time at the show, and I have to say that the content has been fantastic, at least in my opinion so far. In particular, I thought the CMO panel was excellent. Some of the data from Ubiquity. And what we wanted to do with this session was contribute to the conversation, but from a slightly different perspective, which is that from kind of the buy side or the demand side. Now, as Derek mentioned, I'm the head of strategy for Amobee. For those of you who are not familiar with Amobee by name, two things. Number one, it's Amobee, not Adobe. So I've had, I think, 5 people today so far come up and say, hey, we love working with Adobe. I've had some come up and say, we love working with Amobee. But there is an important distinction. I apologize for any confusion in the naming. It wasn't my choice. If you have a concern, please send an email to our marketing team. Number two is that if you want to understand kind of what we do or historically where we fit into the market, it really starts with this. So all of the 3-letter acronyms in the industry that many of you hate, we helped create. Right? So that's been our role. So in 2007, with our Turn platform, we were one of the first demand-side platforms to launch. In 2009, we began RTB ad impression buying in conjunction with SSPs. In 2010, we introduced DMP technologies. So all of these technologies, and by the way, this is not about Amobee, it's a variety of other technology vendors as well. All of these technologies were built to solve a very specific problem. And that problem was this wealth or this massive quantity of unsold or remnant display advertising. And it's a really important concept to keep in mind as we kind of move forward and we talk about what is the evolution of audience targeting, what is the evolution of programmatic. It's helpful to understand its origins because that helps you to understand its limitations and therefore where some of the opportunities are or are not going forward. So these platforms, when they were built, whether it was ours or whether it was the others, they were all built around this concept of demand constraint as opposed to supply constraint. And when you have that as a foundation, it means everything that you do, every way that you solve problems is completely different. There is no construct of upfronts. There is no construct of guarantees or really any forms of reservations. Now, over the last several years, the industry has added another 3-letter acronym called PMPs, and then another one called PG and PGA, Programmatic Guaranteed with Audience. And these have been minor incremental steps towards what has been the traditional planning and buying process between marketers, agencies, and the broadcasters. Now, the reason why for the past decade we've spent so much time developing these technologies is very, very simple. They work really well. So we get tremendous results out of the application of marketers' data and algorithms to make individual impression buying decisions within a real-time bidded environment, and being able to determine what is the price to pay for that impression on the fly based on the interpretation of hundreds to thousands of data points that get factored in from what is the user, what is the content, what is the geography, what is the weather, what is the location, what is the measurement telling us. So what I want to do is take a step through on a couple of slides here of kind of what this means on the advertiser side, because I don't know that everybody kind of gets that perspective if you're coming from the broadcasters. So this is an example, this is a North American-centric example. This is an automotive OEM that we work with, one of the major national brands. This is data that's used in a subset of their brands. It's not a global for everything that this particular OEM does. And what you're looking at are 3 discrete audience clusters. So these are custom definitions of audiences that are relevant for this particular brand. Or it's actually a couple of different brands. They do the analysis across different car lines. And so the data originates from tracking who are the consumers who interact with the OEM's content on their website and also technically on their mobile apps. So it's tracking customers who are logging in. It's also tracking prospects or potential prospects who are doing research on the products. And what you'll see here when we talk about audiences and audience targeting is that this is a very, very tailored definition. Now, it also looks a lot like traditional persona development that you would have in any kind of marketing department. You have panels every year, every 2 years, you kind of do updated research and you define what are the audience segments that you're selling into. The reason why this is different is that those traditional definitions of persona tend to be completely decoupled from the actual media planning and buying process. It can inform a brief, but it's then translated as content as a proxy for those audiences. Within programmatic advertising, we target explicitly, like this. So it allows us to do a variety of things, and the real power of it from a marketing perspective is the storytelling, because it allows us to create consumer journeys that are designed for segments, to have stages within those consumer journeys, and then to have messaging and creative that are tied to that as well. So when these are applied, what are some of the results that we see from a media return on ad spend perspective? Well, the measurement that was used in this particular OEM, and this is an interesting one because they're a little bit ahead of the curve. The ubiquity data that we were looking at earlier, which I thought was really, really good, and also very accurate because we see the same patterns in the data that we have. Many marketers don't have their offline sales data connected all the way through into their measurement. And so what you wind up having is digital activity being measured for digital advertising. And it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. And so when you look at some of those quotes that come from what Google is saying people should do, oftentimes it's because of errors in measurement that are leading to those conclusions. And so this OEM actually is very advanced. What they've done, and we've been able to do working with them and with their agency, is to connect their dealership information through their central CRM all the way to their online advertising. So we've closed that loop, and we're able to do analytics all the way from true product sale, not a proxy for product sale, into what is the media purchasing. And so what we see is essentially a baseline that's created. We do a lot of A/B testing with them. They're very rigorous in their methodologies, so constant testing. And we have a baseline that's established via content targeting. It's listed as site targeting. And what we have is a little over $100 cost per purchasing user. So this is how much the OEM spent within content targeting in order to drive to sales. Now in comparison, if we look at one form of audience targeting, which is called retargeting, retargeting is very simple. It basically means monitor who goes to the brand's website, and that's an audience, and retarget them. You basically want to just drive them back. It's all very lower funnel activity. But the KPIs they get out of this are extremely compelling, right? So what you have is a 110 cost per user acquisition cost that reduces by over 50% when using retargeting data. So it's incredibly compelling from an analytics and a planning standpoint. Then, if you look at the more nuanced example from the prior slide, those OEM clusters, even better performance, almost a 2/3 reduction in the cost from a marketer's perspective. So if you ever wonder about, well, why so much pressure on being able to use custom first-party data from the brands to be able to define the media they want to buy, this is it. Now, every brand is going to have different charts. It's always going to look a little bit different, but the basic trend is still the same. Now, there's a catch, and it's a very big catch. So that return on ad spend is exceptional when we have the data and when we can apply the data. But this is the other thing that we see, and this is not specific to the OEM. This is an aggregate analysis across multiple brands, across multiple verticals. But what we see consistently is that the scale is not there, right? So it caps out. And what you're seeing in the chart is basically from the left, when you have low investment and you have high frequency, meaning that the investment you have could be spent on the same individual multiple times due to overexposure, lack of control on that. You get very low reach. If you continue to improve that, optimize that, put more money into it, you're going to push up your reach essentially as you would expect. But what we also see is that it hits a ceiling. There are a couple of different ceilings that get hit. One of them is from the technology of digital ad tech, that we don't always have the opportunity to identify who a consumer is. So we may have some data about them, but if they're on Safari on an iOS device, their cookies and their identifiers may have been reset by the operating system, in which case they're not targetable, can't reach them. We also have another dimension of this, and we debated how many kind of slides to put into this presentation. We didn't want to overload it. But the other dimension of this, which is very relevant, is that oftentimes the media that we have access to is the smaller format media. And so while it may be video, It's on a phone. This isn't a phone, but pretend that it is. It's in your hand. It's small. It simply does not have the persuasive capabilities of sight, sound, and motion on bigger screens. And so what we see is a limitation in our ability to apply kind of that power of audience strategies into inventory. Now, as an industry and also Amobee as a technology provider, as we've kind of like continued to work through this problem set, and yes, we have addressable TVs that come online, we have increasing adoption of digital video and the amount of media that we have for that. At the end of the day, we kind of had our AA moment from going back to the case study this morning. We really had a bit of an epiphany that this is going to require not incremental changes to how programmatic advertising works. It's going to take something much more fundamental to that. And so the obvious data that jumps out is the amount of additional reach and the amount of additional time and exposure opportunities that you have from television is a game changer for programmatic. Everything else is minor and it's incremental. But it's not just about what is the additional reach that you have. I'm going to pull up some of the ubiquity data. I'm happy to say that he didn't use this slide, but it is one of theirs, the chart, is that TV doesn't need to be fixed. It works really, really well today. It's decoupled from digital, and in fact, I love the split they have here in the ubiquity analytics around online video and online display. And so as a percentage of budget, TV spend vastly overperforming, and the ROI is still above what we're seeing within digital. So this is an important point. TV does not need to be fixed. It does not mean that there is not significant opportunity, dramatic opportunity to fundamentally change how it works. Yes, that's there, but it's an important distinction because speaking from kind of the technology vendor side, the way that we would typically frame the problems, whether it's inside of a single company or how we talk as an industry, is that we were coming from an incrementalism from remnant display advertising, and everything's been kind of this evolution in progress from there. And TV is a fundamentally different model, and it has tremendous value in driving those upper funnel activities, everything that the panels have been talking about over the first half of today. So from our perspective, we think there is an opportunity for a pretty fundamental shift in market about how we bring together what is the proven power of audience targeting when compared to content alone. And we didn't even get into kind of the intersection of the right audience within the right experience, but the signals are there, they're very, very strong. But there's a fundamental opportunity, but we think it needs to be framed the right way. And it's not about how do we take TV and make it work like programmatic. It's about how do we take programmatic and make it work more like TV. Not identical to how it's been, but much more like it. And so some of you may be aware that earlier this year, Amobee acquired Videology. Videology is the leading technology platform for the planning and activation of advanced TV. Fantastic technology set, fantastic team. Why did we make this purchase? For this reason. We think there are three things that need to happen as an industry and as a technology partner within that industry. We cannot drive all the change ourselves. We can help be a participant and we can collaborate and support, but ultimately it's the broadcasters and the TV platforms that have to decide what they want to embrace. But from our perspective, there are three things that need to come together. The first is the obvious word of convergence, but when we use this word, we're not talking just about what is the media convergence, the transition from linear devices into OTT and the multiple flavors of VOD, and addressable set-top boxes. It's also about the convergence of data. Being able to take what are the data assets that the broadcaster has, some of which was expanded on this morning when talking about the closed caption-based contextual analytics. There's a lot of data broadcasters have, but being able to converge that with the brand data that the agencies have access to, and being able to use that to create different products, different product packaging. And to apply that in the second area, and this is really the critical one. This is the one that the industry in its evolution in programmatic 1.0 fundamentally does not get and needs to think differently about, but it's starting to. Certainly Amobee's investing in this regard, is the idea of constraints. Programmatic 1.0 was built on demand constraint. TV is a function of supply constraint. And so all the tools, all the technology has to think and work very differently. In particular, when you're intersecting, you're converging, what are those different data sets to create unique audience products overlaid on top of media content. And when you do that and you treat it like the proper full video as opposed to short form video where you have ad pods that need to have the proper constraints fulfilled, what is collision, clash, compliance, all of those are constructs that Programmatic 1.0 really does not embrace. So there's a lot of constraint that goes into kind of re-architecting or reinventing how this industry is going to work. And the third area is around control. And I'll be the first to admit I've worked in this industry, I've been developing technology platforms on the buy side since 1998. And we were more than happy in the early to mid 2000s to try to grab as much control of data on behalf of the marketers and to enable them to define what is premium. And if you looked in, I'm guessing a lot of you have never been in the DSP platforms themselves, but it's kind of fascinating from, I think, a broadcaster perspective, because the way they were architected kind of back in the day is there was not even a construct of content. It was just this big, vast surplus of ad impressions that you would plug audiences into. So the ability to control what data is defining the products, the ability to define the product packaging, the ability to define the pricing, the ability to define what quantity you're selling at, whether it's guaranteed or not on an upfront, all of those are controls that should be built into the fundamental architecture about how audience targeting works in a post-programmatic world where we go beyond kind of Programmatic 1.0. And when we do that, what we see happening and what our leading clients, not all of them, but what our leading clients tell us is that they see TV being at the center of the planning experience, where we're able to use the data to get the audience strategies, but at greater scale, that we get from TV across both linear as well as digital, and then to wrap what is like non-TV digital and social around that, to augment it, using auction markets to support what is upfront and what is reserved. So, does this work in a GDPR compliant world? Well, a couple of things that are kind of interesting. Number one, since GDPR was rolled out, activated, however you want to frame it, we've seen ballpark a 15 to 20% reduction in the availability of audience data within the programmatic ecosystem within the European markets. And I say kind of a range because it actually depends what industry vertical you're in. So the data that's available for automotive, the impact is very different than, let's say, retail or something like that. But this has put additional pressure on traditional kind of programmatic advertising strategies. There's less data to work with. A lot of people also don't realize that GDPR, which obviously is a European construct, has global implications. Countries that you might not expect of it, Indonesia and the Philippines, are emulating and in some cases exceeding the GDPR privacy thresholds that have been set. Now, interestingly, from our perspective, broadcasters are pretty uniquely or very well positioned in a GDPR world. They have a lot of data and they have a brand that can communicate with the consumer. And that's really the key within GDPR, is to be able to have a conversation with the consumer and to be able to manage what are their expectations around use of data and to be able to get an opt-in or opt-out controls depending upon what you're trying to accomplish. So that relationship is foundational to being able to activate a data-driven strategy. So we absolutely see the ability to deploy audience-based strategies within TV in a GDPR world. It is non-trivial. It has to be done very carefully. It has to have the right kind of technology and the controls underneath it in order to make that viable. But the other component of this to keep in mind is that while broadcasters have a lot of data, individually, it's unlikely that they're going to match the data assets that Facebook, that Amazon, that Google, that Netflix are going to have. And so being able to have control of data, but have the structure or the platform that enables you to be able to join data assets is really critical. So a lot of people frame this as having walled gardens, and I think that's fair. And I think that broadcasters should have walled gardens. In a GDPR world, it's not just a good idea, it's a necessity. And GDPR is not something to be managed, it really is something to be embraced. And again, I think broadcasters are in a position to be able to do that because of the relationship that they can have with consumers, especially with the increasing use of VOD and digital content. Now, from a platform perspective, what this means is kind of raising the walls, putting up the walls that control your media, control your data, allow you to have control over the definition of premium. But what we would recommend is to frame it that it's not just about creating the walls of that garden, but also creating bridges that connect them together as well. Because going back to Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and the amount of data that they're going to have in order for broadcasters to be long-term competitive in the use of audience strategies, it's quite likely they're going to need to augment their data. And that can come from having bridges to the other broadcaster walled gardens that are in a country market. It is bridges to the agencies. We were talking about some of the agency platforms earlier, such as M Platform, and to the brands themselves. It's about being able to have access to data while maintaining security, while maintaining control, while continuing to have sovereignty over your sales and being able to apply standards across the inventory such that you're creating scalability for the marketers. Going back to that problem statement we had earlier, which is if the marketers cannot scale their data, they will take that budget elsewhere. We have, I don't have a slide for this, we have one client within North America, which is a well-known retailer, that does no TV advertising. They're an outlier, but the reason why they don't is because they don't have the measurement for it that they're getting from digital currently. And so you want to be able to participate in that measurement. You want to be able to allow the data to show what the studies show, what the ubiquity data was illustrating before about the power and the value of TV. We see it in the data, and there's an opportunity to continue to scale that up. So goal for this discussion was just to kind of introduce some additional concepts really from the buyer's perspective and how we look at that evolution from programmatic into television. And historically, it's been stated as a choice, which is programmatic or TV. And we don't think that's the right way to frame it. We don't think that's the solution going forward. It should be an and, right? It is TV and programmatic that can work seamlessly together and is absolutely achievable with the right strategies and with the right technologies and the right partnerships in place to be able to connect the data together. Questions were asked on one of the panels, I think it was the CEO panel earlier, about is there a choice, an or, between what is mass reach and that value proposition of TV and audience targeting? It's not an or, it's an and. You are able to do both, right? With the right tools for the broadcasters, they can design those custom ad products that are bespoke using first-party data, and they can offer that in conjunction with the mass reach products. And as long as they have the right tools in place, they can forecast availability, they can do their upfront selling, and they can manage to the delivery against that. And that can be done across digital, obviously, where you have the addressability. But in addition, the other or is that it's not a choice between digital or linear, but when you apply data, that can be brought to the linear TV planning process as well, making it an and. And that's where it gets really, really compelling for the marketers, is being able to say, talk to us about your custom audience segments. I think one of them was hobby haulers or something like that from that automotive OEM. People who drive a lot, but they also have a lot of hobbies and they carry a lot of stuff around. I think it was a pickup audience in particular. When you can talk to the brand and the agency in the language they want about their audiences, and you're able to work with them on media plans that support those audiences, that allow them to really tailor the customer journey, that's what's going to enable TV to be positioned at the center. So I see the time is flashing. I've actually run out a little bit. I don't know if we have a minute for questions if there are some, or are we hard on the stop? 1 minute. So that's the quick story. Our position on this is that this is evolution for the industry. We're here to be a partner to the broadcasters and the agencies to drive that. Are there any questions you guys have based on the content we talked about? It's so hard to see. I think there's one over here. I'm actually getting glare off my head into my glasses, which makes it even worse to see.
Can you just tell us who you are, please?
Yeah, I'm Claire Arndale from Edit. Surely when you're talking about custom segments, and they're very prescriptive, like the ones that you showed us, and then we're talking about how we can target them through TV, that's still essentially a niche group. So there's going to be quite a lot of crossover between those audiences. So aren't you just building frequency rather than incremental reach?
That's a really interesting question. It's good with a whiteboard and a beer to go over that. So there are a couple of things. Number one, don't have a visual for it. The way to think of those custom audiences is really in concentric circles. And so it's up to the media team, depending upon their campaign objectives, about how tight they want to constrain those. So it may be very, very rigid to what is 3 or 4 dimensions of the data that was shown, or it may be loosened up quite a bit. But another thing that they do in parallel with that, if they're smart, and frequently they're not, but if they're smart, those groups are defined as exclusive in a planning process. So in a Venn diagram, you remove any of the overlap between them. And that is one of the minor things in the industry that sounds so obvious, but one of the challenges we have to true convergence and achieving like audience strategies within the convergence of TV and programmatic is that organizationally, many brands and also some of the agencies still need to catch up and be in a position where they can have teams that are ready to use the tools that enable them to do things like that. Otherwise, they wind up having a lot of the overlap. It's exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, but many thanks indeed to Philip.
Great. Thank you.